Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us in this feast in a series of interviews with IESE, with influential people around the world who are thinking in a creative, innovative way about innovation and learning. Today we are very happy to have with us Nick Shackleton-Jones, who is the Director of Learning and Performance Innovation at PA Consulting, formerly Head of Learning at BP. Hi Nick, and thank you for being with us today. We're very happy to have you here.
It's great to be here.
Hi to everyone. We're going to get the conversation started. At the end, if time's allow us, we're going to have some questions. And while you hear us, if you want to ask any question, please click on the question and answer button that you see at the bottom of your screen. So Nick, I would like to start with a debate we're facing this month, which, if I read your writings correctly, might be a useless debate. This debate is basically about, is it better to have traditional classroom or e-learning, and what are the pros and cons of both? And you basically say they're both ineffective. Can you elaborate a little bit on this?
I'd love to. So we have a fairly kind of hard-hitting way of entering into this conversation that we use. And we start by saying, look, both classroom and e-learning are ineffective. Classroom is kind of liked, but it's costly and it's ineffective. And e-learning is disliked. It's equally ineffective, but it's cheap. And what I mean it's ineffective, that's a very sort of bold statement. Well, it's ineffective in the sense that the research around knowledge retention varies, but there's a consensus that something like 65% of knowledge from a classroom is lost within, a couple of weeks.
65%.
65%, and it continues to deteriorate thereafter. But the point of that conversation is not to dismiss, but rather to say, actually, face-to-face time is hugely valuable, as is digital kind of support we can give people, if we just reframe our thinking a little bit. So what I mean by reframing is, I absolutely think it's important that people have an experience, and probably that is the secret value that people are getting from what we are calling classroom. We imagine that it's there as a mechanism for transferring knowledge, but if we even just listen to what people are telling us, they tell us it's a great experience to meet people, to share stories, to network, to try things out, to get feedback. And that's what I think we should be doing, experience design. I don't think we should look at those sessions as fundamentally knowledge transfer sessions. I think we should look at them as opportunities for experience design. And of course, many people are tacitly doing that already today. And I think the digital, again, shouldn't be a way to simply dump knowledge, a channel, if you like, for pushing content. This is our major critique, I think, of that industry, is that it's just content dumping. Instead, we should be thinking about the useful digital assets that we can create. The reason we use Google is because it's a quick way for us to get useful advice and guidance and information. And we can use within organizations digital in the same way to give people access to the stuff that they need as they need it. So to summarize, our argument is that, classroom and e-learning are neither are very effective. A number of studies show from a knowledge transfer perspective, they're not great, but experience design and performance support, those are very effective.
And so you are basically suggesting that we as educators should provide two things, right? Resources and experiences. And you typically describe resources as tools, techniques that people can use when facing their challenges, whereas experiences are providing participants with new challenges, right? Because if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying we are too much focusing on content, forgetting the context, and the context in which people learn is basically when they're challenged. Is that right?
Yes, but there's some deep subtlety here, and since this is a sophisticated audience, I'll explain it a little bit further. I think the resources are not the same ambition as the experiences. By that I mean the objectives of an educational institution and a corporation are quite different. An educational institution may legitimately be concerned with learning. And actually within organizations, kind of private or public sector, is performance. Now that's important because actually resources reduce learning. We just repeat that. The point of the performance support is not to encourage learning, but to reduce it, to enable somebody who has maybe just joined the organization to perform very quickly without having to learn anything. So that's a completely different ambition. And so to your point, yes, I think in an educational context, the focus shifts to experiences. How can we build experiences within an educational context which resemble those that people will encounter in the real world and enable them to develop those capabilities that they will need and skills to tackle the challenges that they will have in the real world. So it's not merely two channels for doing the same thing. It's two different kinds of ambition, one to reduce learning, the other to build learning or capability.
And how do you see the fit of two things that are important to us, new technologies and teaching with cases? So how do you see the fit with new technologies and cases in this framework of resources and experiences? What should we be doing according to you?
Yeah. So I think new technologies offer opportunities on these two axes. SatNav, imagine SatNav for everything. So that's one thing we talk a lot to organizations about, which is, could we build a guidance system that tells everybody how to do their job? And this is sort of externalizing learning. And that might be a horrifying prospect to some people, because really it means that you will build organizational performance by reducing capability. So technology has a big role to play in that dimension, but that's mainly kind of AI. AI and automated guidance is about taking implicit knowledge currently, which somebody might take 20 years to build, and then converting it into a guidance system, as we do with SatNav. You know, it's not that difficult, which tells people what to do. And a stepping stone along that path is resources. In some ways, though, the more exciting opportunities, I think, with technology are in the experiential space. The link with case studies is, I think learning should be contextualized, and case studies give us an opportunity to do that, to contextualize learning, but moreover to recreate some of those scenarios so that people live through those contexts. So a case study is a stepping stone on the way to a piece of experience design. Today we can sit in a room and consider a case study and how an organization, you know, handled a challenge, but it's also interesting then to build those challenges. In case that sounds a bit abstract, let me give you a real example. We're looking at an organization who were facing the challenge of completely transforming their business model. From a very conventional, this is a multi-billion-dollar global organization, a very conventional business, to this new entrepreneurial mindset. And so instead of saying, well, we'll build some training courses and we'll talk about VUCA and, you know, Agile and so on, we said, let us map out the challenges that you face if you are building a startup. Things like re-understanding who your customers are, thinking about how your product fits into their everyday life, thinking about public relations, thinking about social media. Let's think about all these challenges, and then we will build all of those challenges. And you will have to go through them. One day you'll be hit with a viral social media campaign against you, and you'll have to think about what you have to do. The next day you'll meet some customers. Then you'll take some calls from people who are unhappy with your product, and you'll have to decide what to do. So going beyond simply case studies to actually building out those challenges and experiences so that people live through them.
So let me build on something you just said. You mentioned that to help this company, you said, why don't we map the challenges you're currently facing, right? But
Yeah.
if we know something about, you know, current world, everyone is saying there's only one thing that is constant, which is change, right? Everything is changing. And maybe we think we have challenges today, and maybe these will not be the challenges of tomorrow. And we don't know today the challenges of tomorrow. So if all the learning experience is about the challenges that we are facing, can we teach something, a more general capability on how to face challenges in general? Because maybe we don't know what are the challenges of tomorrow, right? So how would you deal with that?
That's such a good question. And I think you probably know how I'll answer that. I'm not 100% confident, though. I would say that you build those deeper problem-solving and creative capabilities through presenting people with a series of challenges which may not resemble the challenges they have in future, but will have features in common. And that, of course, is, I guess, the essence of creativity, being able to extrapolate from one set of challenges that you've solved in one way to another. But if you push me on the research basis of that, I'd be a little less confident. But that's my feeling, at least. I could probably dig out some support for it, that actually by presenting people with lots of problem-solving situations, they're better equipped to adapt to new problem-solving situations. Really, I guess you're training them to be flexible in their approach, and certain skills such as situational awareness or decision-making. And I think we have done that kind of work within the oil and gas industry. Yeah, where what you're trying to do is to prepare people for a crisis. And of course, the problem with a crisis is typically people are dealing with it for the first time. And so how they behave is somewhat unpredictable. But what you can do is simulate, as we did, similar crises and get them to pause the action, if you like, and look at themselves and how they're behaving and how decision-making is being made in that situation and how they're prioritizing. And that prepares them better in the unlikely event they encounter the real thing.
So basically, if I understand it correctly, your approach is we cannot predict the future, but we can imagine it. And let's assume this is going to be the future. What are we going to do? Is this basically the way you approach?
Yeah.
And some of the comments that I've read also about your approach on resources experiences but it's difficult to get people creative in this way because it's pretty much focused on the task, it's pretty much focused on the challenge. But is there any room for innovation, right? Is there any room for moving above and beyond the challenges that we are facing today? How would you react to that?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the advantages of doing challenge-based kind of learning or experience design, is that there's a risk that otherwise learning becomes very didactic. So you get the so-called sage on the stage, and they say, for example, about leadership, this is how you should be as a leader, this is how you should tackle this challenge. What we found when we actually built some of these challenges that we did for this organization, about thinking about, for example, how to rebuild your organization, who to recruit, was that people would come up with ideas that we hadn't thought of. So the format of those sessions was as follows. We would set people a challenge the day before. It would come out of the blue. They would have to work together as a team to solve the challenge, whatever it was, social media or restructuring the organization or rethinking their product. And then they would come together the next day and say what solution they were going to implement. And they would get feedback from subject matter experts. But the interesting thing was, quite often they would come up with ideas and solutions that the subject matter experts hadn't thought of, and would say, "Yeah, that's a really interesting idea." And I think we've learned something from that challenge. And then you can cycle their ideas and their experience into knowledge sharing more broadly within the organization. So it becomes quite a creative process if you make it challenge based.
So, and I guess you have applied your framework in a number of companies. So can you recognize any differences, any different nuances when you're working with SMEs versus large firms? Is this something that you can apply all companies, all industries, different sizes, different challenges? Or is there any nuances that you want to stress depending on the context?
I think there are a great many nuances working with large organizations and small. Maybe just a couple of them to highlight. I think for large organizations, it's a shame, but education has drifted into being about risk mitigation. So to some extent, I think we're working against a decline in the reputation of L&D within big organizations towards simply being the people who get everybody through the sheep dip process. And I don't think that's a space that we really want to be in. Big organizations, I think, are they have more of an appetite, I think, for digital. There becomes a point typically where digital becomes a really good solution for a large organization, where perhaps something more experiential is good for smaller organizations. And I think also there's something funny that goes on with big organizations. They are hierarchical, as we know, much more so than smaller. And they tend to hire people into a parent-child model. So they implicitly look for people who are sort of good at following orders. And this means that the nature of the kind of thing that you can do with them, with experience design in particular, is sometimes quite different. So yeah, there are lots of differences, but those are some of the ones that spring to mind.
So, and you were saying many large companies are attracted by digital, okay? So is that a matter of capabilities that only large companies, is it a matter of resources? Why do you think it's mostly large companies that are attracted by that?
I think that there's a couple of reasons. Cost efficiency. I think that large companies start to look very closely at the training budget. Because they have a training budget. In a small organization, you may not even have a training budget. It may simply be that all of the learning is just happening from peer to peer. But large companies start to systematize things, and so they're looking for reduction in cost. I also think that there's large companies are often set up on the basis of rigidity over time. So, this is my opinion. There may be people on the line who are far better qualified to talk about this, but my impression is that a lot of how they maintain stability is through policy and process. And this becomes a core challenge for the organization because they want to maintain that rigidity through enforcement and communication of policy and process over time, but they also have an appetite for change, and especially now in this volatile environment. And those two things work against each other. So the sort of challenges that you face in large organizations are they want to be leaders who are innovative and entrepreneurial, but hey, they've hired a whole bunch of people who are hierarchical and risk averse, and become even more risk averse the higher up you go in the organization. So that's sort of challenge that a large organization has, perhaps, that a smaller organization doesn't.
So let me ask a couple of questions from our own perspectives. So this idea about resources and experiences is very fascinating, but let's face it, we as a business school, we have some assets in place, physical assets, the classroom, intellectual assets, technological assets, set up in a way, with what you would call maybe traditional way of learning. So can we actually couple our current way of doing business with the ideas of resources and experiences, or should we just rethink about the whole process? Because, we also are facing some constraints, right? Because even though you don't like them, we need to provide a syllabus to students in which, to some extent, we need to tell them this is the objectives for this course, this is what you're going to learn. Can we incorporate some of the ideas that you're pushing without revolutionizing completely the way of...
Yes. Absolutely. I think there's an opportunity. I think, though, that there's a good path and a bad path. And I think many organizations are going down the bad path. And I think the bad path I would describe, perhaps candidly, as sort of monetizing reputation. So going down the path of creating MOOCs and e-learning modules in place of kind of classrooms. I think this is bad because effectively it's just... it's a kind of a short-term solution. It rests, I think, on an economics which says that the knowledge from this institution has a certain value, and we can sell it a bit cheaper, and what the customer gets is a certificate. The problem is that certificate itself is dropping in value. So in the old days, we would hire people into organizations, in the old days, say maybe 20, 30 years ago, who had a degree in English literature, but they would do a completely unrelated job. And that didn't matter because we all understood that was how the system worked. You can effectively forget all your knowledge that you gained through university. The certificate tells us that you're a reasonably intelligent person, as I think you might say, kind of a signaling device. And that's enough for us, and we retrain you. That economy is breaking down because you may not stay with us now very long. So we're not assuming that you'll be here 20 years and that 5 years of training will be a good investment. So now we want to know much more about what your capabilities are. We want badges that say, you have done this, you have done this, you have done this, you can do this. And the existing institutions could take that path instead. And that would mean, I'll give you a real example, cybersecurity. That's going to become something very interesting for lots of organizations for different reasons. And so what would a curriculum look like and competence look like for that? Well, on the new model, it would be lots of evidence of having tackled different kinds of problems, building a curriculum which was, as I would call it, a learn-earn gradient, where you gradually tackle problems of increasing sophistication towards the end of the program. They're actually real problems. If you're wondering, is that fanciful, Duolingo do something like that. My understanding is that you start out learning a language, and you are just purely learning. But by the time you achieve a certain level of competence, some of the translation that you're doing is real translation work. So you have, seamlessly shifted from learning to earning by tackling real pieces of work. And I think that there's an opportunity to build a model like that, where people get experiences which enable them to develop capabilities and a proven record of competence.
So before taking some questions from the audience, let me ask a question on one of your provocative posts, in which you're basically saying, in the future, learning will be less important. Meaning that due to artificial intelligence, machine learning, and a number of progresses in technology, we will not have to learn a number of things that we have to learn now, like, for instance, typing. So no more learning in the future? Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah. This is a challenging idea. I think many of us who work in learning, we've sort of fallen in love with learning, as I have, and we feel that learning will always be there, will always increase in the future. But what I see around me is really very different. I see that we are systematically reducing the need to learn. So to give a couple of examples, my first computer was a BBC Micro B, and it came with these big manuals, and you had to learn all of that stuff before you could use the computer. It would take months to learn all that. And now, of course, technology, we don't expect it to ship with any manuals at all. And we laugh at the fact that a 3-year-old can use an iPad. We think it's very funny. But what's actually happened there is somebody has eliminated learning. And you see the same with cars. So you used to have to learn a lot. And you used to have to use maps. I remember slide rules. And now you don't have to use a map because you have sat-nav, and soon you won't have to learn how to drive a car because it's automated. And I think people just assume that somehow we will just learn other stuff. But really, user experience design is the systematic elimination of learning to build a world where you need to learn less to operate. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, organizations need to do that if they're to remain competitive. They really want to hire people with very limited capability. There's an anxiety I hear expressed a lot about how will we build capability for the future? Or maybe you won't have to, because we make every job as easy as driving a car. We just can take a 12-year-old and say, you are now an HR advisor. How could you do that? Well, you could program an automated assistant to sit next to them, something like Amazon's Alexa product, to advise them as they go every step of the way. And that would give you huge competitive advantage if you're able to do that. And we're already seeing organizations traveling down that path. So I suspect that what we'll see in future is, yes, there will be a small group of people with very high levels of capability in the area of, say, data or artificial intelligence, but a sort of a squeezed middle with a large number of people whose capabilities are actually much reduced from what we would consider to be the average today.
So let me take a pretty related question from the audience. There is Arturo asking, do you think that trends like virtual reality and gamification can improve the performance of corporate learning? And which digital technologies are the most promising for learning at work?
Yeah, very interesting. Two questions and two answers then. So gamification, can it improve learning? Well, we've done quite a lot of work with gamification, and we can improve performance. But sometimes you're improving performance at the cost of learning. So yes, you can give people badges and tokens, and there's some research in our own research that suggests that millennials, for example, whether you like millennials or not, as a generational term. But future generations expect more recognition for everything they do. And so we've used gamification to give people points for each piece of learning that they do. But you can also use gamification to drive performance in a direction and sidestep learning as well. So I think it's a powerful technique, but it can be used not necessarily to improve learning, but just to focus on performance. I also think, in answer to your other question, VR is a very promising technology because of its ability to recreate experiences at reduced cost. Perhaps I can give you a real example. If you are a big automobile manufacturer and you want to, train lots of people in another country, but you don't want to fly those people or the trainers backwards and forwards, you can recreate in VR a situation, a performance situation, so that they can practice it on a factory production line somewhere else in the world. So I think that's an interesting technology, but it's much abused. I mean, I've been in VR experiences which have just been a recreation of a classroom, which is crazy. But the other technology, of course, which is super promising, is this one that I'm using right now, the iPhone. And I'll tell you why that's so interesting. Because we go into organizations and they say, oh, we'd like to do all this cool stuff with resources and videos, but we don't really have the infrastructure. And they say, hang on, what do your employees have a smartphone? And they say, yeah. And we say, well, you have the infrastructure. And they say, well, maybe we don't have the software. And we say, do they have WhatsApp? And they say, yeah. Well, then you have the software. And so what we're seeing is the shift from the technology which the company owned, being the way that you get performance support to people, to being the technology, the infrastructure and the software that the employee has already in their hands. And that has, I think, huge opportunities for organizations.
Now, we have another similar question about simulations. Do you think the simulation may be relevant educational experience, and how do they compare? Can they replace case studies? Can they complement them? What do you think about simulations in general?
I think it's hard to design good simulations. I think that with case studies or scenarios, and we've built lots.
So you're basically saying we are overestimating the importance of simulation, perhaps, if it's so hard to design them?
I think it's easy to talk about. It's difficult to do well. So a lot of the simulation we do is with actors in a room. So it's a real simulation. It doesn't have to be a technology thing. And if you think about how easy it is to have actors in a room and simulate a situation, how much harder is it to do with technology? Well, then it will take some time. So I think the beauty of case studies and scenarios and face-to-face simulation is that, for the moment at least, they can be done much more easily than kind of VR or augmented reality simulations.
So thank you again, Nick. Thank you so much. Our time is almost over, so I would like to take the opportunity to thank you. You've given us tremendous food for thought. Your ideas are provocative and made us think a lot. And we're sure we'll be extremely helpful in revising our programs as well.
Thank you. Well,
thank you, Nick, and thank you to everyone. We hope you will join us in the next interviews, which is going to be in September 15. Thanks again, and have a great summer.